Shalom. This video is to talk about an important new book by Natan Sharansky, who was the very important refusenik, fighter for Soviet Jewry and for human rights in Russia under the Soviet regime, and has been a minister in the government of Israel. He spoke to 170 rabbis and cantors at the American Israel Public Affairs Committee meeting in Washington, and he gave us all a signed copy of the book, Defending Identity. Important book, and just wanted to talk about it a little bit. There's a prevailing view in the liberal community about how identity is bad. It causes problems. And he found in his experience being arrested for working for human rights and for his Jewry rights that some people thought, the human rights people thought, that working for Soviet Jewry was against their cause, and the people working for Soviet Jewry thought that the human rights issue, the democracy issue, had nothing to do with Soviet Jewry. And his book is about the important linkage between identity and freedom, identity and democracy. Now, first of all, why do some people think that identity is bad, and what does he say about it? I just want to read you some terrific passages from this book. He says on page 4, who could blame anyone for viewing identity as a kind of poison that endangers our world? However, identity can be used destructively. It is a crucial force for good. Strong identities are as valuable as to a well-functioning society as they are to a secure and committed, well-functioning individual. And then he goes on to say, for some in the democratic world committed to freedom and human rights, identity means prejudice, intolerance, distrust, and violence. But for many committed to identity, pure freedom seems egoistic, materialistic, decadent, and weak. What he found, being in jail, was that those who find themselves newborn to identity discover the incredible depth of history, the power of belonging, of connecting to past generations, of shaping future ones, of living a life that is beyond the self. And when he discovered that he was a Jew, he said it gave him unbelievable identity. Why? Well, for example, he says on page 3, those who feel a connection to ideals and values beyond the individual self, who believe that they are participating in a grand collective adventure, who are convinced that they are acting on behalf of past and future generations, are prepared to make great individual sacrifices. So what is identity? Well, he says it's not easy to formulate, involve a person's connection with history. It can mean the desire to have children be part of this history, to educate them about a valued past, so that it becomes part of their future. It could mean belonging to a religious, national, ethnic group. One university quality of identity is that it gives life meaning beyond life itself. It offers a connection to a world beyond itself. So what happened to him was he was deprived of his identity and his freedom, and he discovered them both. So he says, for example, on page 14, despite the privations, the act of breaking out of the world of doublethink was a wildly liberating experience. Almost simultaneously, two struggles, the struggles for freedom and human rights, and the struggle to recapture my Jewish identity, joined as one experience. Now, the Soviet movement killed millions of people. Stalin, under the guise of a united world, they tried to destroy identity of any kind. What he finds is that identity and freedom go hand in hand, are necessary to create one another. He said, it was only then I started learning about my Jewish identity. The moment I discovered this connection between identity and freedom, this attachment to my history and my people, I discovered an enormous source of strength. Because the KGB kept saying to him, just tell us that we're right and you're wrong and you can go free. And what kept him for all those years in solitary confinement and not being able to communicate with anyone was his deep knowledge that he would be then letting down his community, that he couldn't abandon his moral principles. And it was identity that gave him that function. Now, he says one of the great crises in the world is that Europe is now undergoing that real problem. There's a general view in the European community that identity is decadent. He says multiculturalism is not tolerant of the previously dominant national cultures of Europe. Along with the other post-identity ideologies, multiculturalism calls on European societies to weaken their own national uniqueness and recognize that Europe's cultural tradition should not be defining or determinative. And so what's happening is Europe is going to be destroyed by the invasion of the Muslims. In the book Infidel and in London Istan and While Europe Slept, 3 new books about this problem. They describe how mosques in Europe, imams openly spew the most extreme language. Despite being funded by the very governments they denounce, they vilify Western life as decadent. Today in communities in European cities, gender apartheid is entrenched. Genital mutilation is practiced. Forced marriages are commonplace. Severe restrictions are imposed on women's movements and education. Women are murdered in honor killings. All this on page 75 and 76. Above all is the threat of Islamic terror in Europe, with hundreds of terrorist networks involving hundreds of people. So he says one would hope that in the face of this menacing threat, European societies under attack would be able to mobilize European citizenry to defend the democratic culture they spent centuries building. But the triumph of post-identity ideology among the intellectual classes and its permeation into mainstream discourse has made this all but impossible. Although it may seem obvious the answer to Europe's problem lies in vigorously defending the identity that is under assault, we must remember that to many Europeans, identity is the cause of evil. And that, he sums up, is the central problem facing Europe. And then he has a whole section here about how the human rights, quote-unquote, movement has gotten completely backwards, and that the one democratic country in the world, in the Middle East, Israel, is under constant assault by the human rights people, when all the nations that surround Israel, which are barbarians, basically, and have no human rights, persecute women and gays and don't have anyone but Muslims have freedom, and even the Muslims are under assault. Certainly Christians are under assault. They are the ones pouncing on the one democracy. He also has an interesting section about the development in Reform Judaism in terms of identity. On pages 128 and 129, he talks about how at the beginning, the Reform movement, born out of this European ideology in 1885, declared we are no longer a nation but a religious community. And then he shows in the various Reform platforms from 1937, 1976, 1997, there's been a gradual development of increased identity, and so that in 1997, Reform Judaism affirmed our ancient covenant and unique history among the nations to be witness to God's presence. There's been a steady move away from the fear of maintaining a separate identity to a sense that it's precisely only such an identity that can be sustained over time. Anyway, those are some of the reflections on the book. He has a long section about Israel and how the key to Israeli society is to maintain freedom and strong identity. He has a long section in the 170s about the increasing movement in the world to say that Israel has no right to exist. I mean, there's no other nation in the world which says that, which is told they don't have a right to exist. There's only one Jewish nation in the world of over 65 predominantly Muslim nations. The Muslims don't want to have Israel there. They want to have a world without a Jewish state. Certainly in the territory they believe is theirs. The Jews have the best claim to land in any nation in history, politically, religiously, and yet there's this movement of Israel has no right to exist. And he says only by strengthening Jewish identity and the Jewish state can peace be possible. And he says appeasement never works. He has a long section here giving examples of when Barak tried to appease Arafat by giving him everything, Arafat at the same time was denying Jewish history, saying Jews had no connection to the land, just out and out lies. And then he started the Intifada. So appeasing Arafat didn't work, and Sharansky resigned from the Barak government at that time because of that. And then he resigned from the Sharon government because he knew appeasing the Palestinians by turning Gaza over to Hamas, which a lot of us thought was a good idea at the time, turned out to be a disaster because daily rockets are flying from Gaza into Israel. He resigned at that time too, realizing that appeasement is no solution. And so and then he talked about Arabs in Israel, and he says this on page 194. The Arab minority of Israel has the highest standard of living, the highest level of education, and the lowest death rate and mortality rate for children of any comparable population in the Arab world. Similarly, Arab parliamentarians in the Knesset have a freedom to criticize their own government they do not have in any other parliament of the Arab world. It is not surprising that the Israeli Arabs are adamantly opposed to giving up their Israeli citizenship. In fact, a huge number of Palestinians try to obtain Israeli citizenship. He never heard a single case where a citizen of Israel wanted to become a citizen of any other Arab country.
And just think about that for a minute, about the way in which Israel treats, has Arab citizens that are the happiest of any Arabs in any country in the world. And so, not only can Israel remain a Jewish and democratic state, he says its survival depends on it. So that's some of the ideas that he has in this magnificent book. I certainly suggest that you read it. Again, it's Defending Identity by Natan Sharansky.